Now, in your document, you've listed 10 very good ideas in the business summary, and I want to take them, each one of those ideas, and move it into an actual implementation plan. My team will review each of those over the next few weeks and develop an action plan for implementation. And I would like to meet before January 15th with Pat Wrighton, with the steering committee from the Business Summit, with legislative leadership of both parties and leadership from the labor community to develop a common strategy to move these ideas forward in the next legislative session and beyond. And I very much appreciate the hard work you've done and your willingness to endorse a common set of priorities that we can push forward together. Let me also say that when I was in Washington, D.C. earlier this month, I met with Secretary of Transportation LaHood about funding for the Columbia River Crossing project, and I spoke last week with Governor Gregoire, and we plan to meet with Secretary LaHood again early next year to see what we can do to move this important project forward. Now, creating jobs and increasing incomes is central to the future of the state of Oregon, but equally important is reversing the trend of disinvestment in education and spending those resources on corrections and avoidable human resource costs. And that means effectively managing through this upcoming budget crisis by shifting the focus from cutting programs to redesigning the way we provide public services. We should remember that this is not the first time that Oregon's boom-bust economy has put us in this position. Now, traditionally, state government has simply cut from this structure during lean times and then added it back during good times, but leaving the basic nature of the structure essentially intact. And that cycle has been repeated over and over and over again, and it's left us where we are today. Again, it's time to break decisively from the past. Think of Oregon as a house that was built decades ago. And think of Oregonians as a family who's lived in that house for generations. Now, the way the house was designed probably made sense at the time it was built. But over time, the family and its needs and the way it lives have changed, but the structure of the house hasn't. There are too many rooms, and they aren't the right size. There's no insulation, and the windows are drafty, and the cost of keeping this house up is more than the family can afford. The roof needs to be replaced. The siding's falling off. And at some point, simply patching things up isn't good enough. The point comes when you have to build a new house that's affordable and that's designed for the way the family needs and the way the family lives. That is the opportunity that's embedded in this budget crisis. For better or for worse, the Great Recession has leveled the House of Oregon to its foundations, and we have the opportunity to rebuild it for the 21st century. And this is an opportunity that we literally cannot afford to miss. Over the current biennium, our public programs have been propped up by almost $1.3 billion in one-time revenue from the federal stimulus plan, from the rainy day fund, from the tobacco tax, the provider tax, and a host of other one-time revenues. And most of those resources went into the state school fund for primary and secondary education, and they went into the Oregon Health Plan. Now, while these one-time revenues were important in the sense that they helped preserve important public services over the last 2 years, they also delayed the time when we were forced to think about not just how to pay for services, but how we deliver those services in the first point. So 1/3 of the $3.5 billion deficit is based on the assumption that we're simply going to backfill those one-time revenues with general fund. And the fact is, the general fund simply is not there. This is the legislative session when we must stop kicking the can down the road and start redesigning the way we provide public services in the state of Oregon. It is not only important, it is imperative if we hope to manage forward and still provide the services on which our private sector economy depends. So instead of creating a budget that simply does less of the same, with the hope that sometime in the future we can do more of the same, I intend to provide a budget and a set of structural reforms that will do things very, very differently. Last week, for example, I appointed several transition teams to look at how we're going to organize and lead and manage our system of public education through the next 2 years and beyond. Education, as you know, is the single largest, and I would argue the single most important public investment we make. It constitutes 52% of Oregon's general fund. And I've asked these transition teams to approach the budget by asking a very, very different question than we've ever asked in the past. So the question is not, what will we cut? The question is how we can take the revenue that we know we have and invest it differently going forward to create a solid foundation on which we can rebuild for the future. This next 6 months is going to require innovation throughout state government, but particularly in the way we approach public education, health care, and public safety. And it's also going to require something else. It's going to require that we approach each other differently. It's going to require that we engage the best minds in this state, regardless of their party affiliation. It's going to require that we recognize that we are in this together and that we can only get out of it together, that we recognize that the only path forward for all of us is through a $3.5 billion budget deficit, and that we need to recognize that the degree of civility with which we deal with one another as we make a series of very difficult but essential decisions is going to set the course of this state for a decade. There were those in Oregon who were surprised when I appointed Ron Saxton to co-lead the transition team on primary and secondary education. I think most of you here know Ron, longtime attorney at Ader Wynn, former member of the Portland School Board, former Republican candidate for governor, and now executive vice president at JELD-WYN in Klamath Falls. Ron has a deep understanding of and commitment to public education, and we're very, very fortunate that he has been willing to give his time and his knowledge and skills to this effort. I want to take this opportunity to introduce to you a few people that you might not know. Seated at this table is Gail Rasmussen, who is the president of the Oregon Education Association. Gail. Hannah Vandering, the vice president, and Ron Sanders, their new executive director. Thank you for coming. I want us to all recognize that those who teach and work in our system of public education and those who provide the other important public services on which each and every one of us depend are going to be key partners over the next 2 years in building a more secure future for the state of Oregon. Our success in this endeavor is going to require our willingness to move beyond the past and forge a new future. It's going to require a willingness to build new partnerships and coalitions, on our willingness and, in fact, our success in building a new operational political center in the state of Oregon that will allow us to roll up our sleeves and address these problems not as partisans and not as stakeholders, but as citizens of a state who share a common future. Now, the final step in rebuilding our state is to recognize that the kind of transformational change that is required can't happen overnight or over the course of a single biennium. It's going to require a sustained and consistent effort over the next 8 to 10 years, built on such a solid foundation that it can continue to move forward and be sustained regardless of changes in the executive branch or partisan changes in the makeup of the legislature. And doing so requires that we move from a 2-year budget to a 10-year budget frame, move from a 2-year current service level budget to true outcomes-based budgeting, which will provide us a roadmap for the individual decisions that we have to make along the way, and that will inform us as to whether our individual choices move us towards or steer us away from our long-term objective. So towards that end, I have appointed a transition team to design a 10-year budget for the state of Oregon, to prepare a plan to fully implement that budget during the 2013-2015 biennium, but also to use that budget to inform the choices and decisions we make in the 2011-2013 budget. Jim Pyro from Portland General Electric has consented to lead this transition team, and we'll be announcing the other members shortly. Let me just conclude my remarks this afternoon by reminding you 2 things. First, notwithstanding the seriousness of this recession and the budget deficit, there is a huge opportunity embedded in this fiscal crisis if we have the wisdom and the courage and the commitment to seize it. The second thing I want to remind you of is that every other state in the nation is facing exactly the same kind of fiscal crisis that we have in Oregon, and so is the federal government. And while the federal government has the capacity to push the difficult political decisions into the growing budget deficit, at least for a while, which amounts to no more than running up a huge bill on our children's credit card, states, I am glad to say, don't have that luxury. Sooner or later, Every state in this country, and indeed our nation itself, is going to have to come to terms with the growing divergence between the cost of public programs and our ability to pay for them, and public expectations and the reality of fiscal limits. For Oregon, that moment has arrived. Somewhere in the nation, somewhere in America, a state needs to demonstrate that it's possible to manage through this kind of fiscal crisis without losing our sense of community, without losing our commitment to one another, and emerge from the other side more united, more intentional, and more optimistic about the future than we were when we went in. Let's make that state our state. Let's make that state the state of Oregon. Thank you very much.
Governor, thank you. Thank you for bringing your considerable expertise to bear on the problems that we have. Thank you for supporting the efforts of so many here today to put together a common sense roadmap. We really look forward to the surmounting those challenges and partnering with you as we get to the kind of Oregon we really want to see. So I'll tell you, I'm pumped up. I want to get out of here, start working on this stuff as soon as we can, and actually, that's what we're about to do.